The recording quality was poor, but the voice was crystal clear. It was my father's voice, saying I would never amount to anything. This wasn't some old memory. It was a voicemail I had recorded myself 2 weeks ago on my own phone, and now I was feeding it into audio transcription software in a conference room in Columbus, Ohio. Because it was now a file of evidence under case number WL2024. My name is Margaret Caron, and I am a forensic accountant. My job is to find lies in the numbers, in the places where people think no one is looking. It was 7:39 in the morning when I opened that file, took a sip from my thermos, and started digging through the annual filing history of Whitfield Logistics on my screen. It was my brother Greg's company. This was supposed to be my routine audit. It turned out to be anything but. Because as I scrolled through the Delaware Secretary of State's database, I saw a name that was my own. In the registered agent column since 2018 without a single break. I had never signed up for this designation, at least not that I could remember. But there was my name, my old apartment address, and a notary stamp that had long since expired. If you had seen me in that moment, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. No gasping, no pushing the chair back. Just a woman sitting by her laptop, slowly opening a new Excel sheet and typing its first column, timeline of filings. If your family has ever overlooked your hard work, let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel, Storyhaven Daily, because this story is just getting started. I didn't know that day how useful this designation would turn out to be. All I knew was the verdict I had heard 15 years ago, and I had never forgotten it. It wasn't a promise. It was actually a ruling, handed down by my father at the dining table of our home on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, when I was 17. The address was 1214 Maplewood Court, a house where the wallpaper was always fading to a pale yellow, and where every major decision was made at the dining table on that heavy oak desk my mother had once bought from Sears. I was the eldest of 3 kids in that house. Greg was the middle child, and my younger sister Denise was the youngest. My role was never written down, but everyone knew it. When Greg broke a neighbor's car side mirror, I paid for it out of my allowance, no questions asked. When Denise got suspended in high school, I was the one who talked to the principal, made excuses, and smoothed things over. My parents never got involved in the mess because I always stepped in, quietly, without a single complaint, as if it were my job. I remember that evening, at 6:19 p.m., when I told my father I wanted to go into accounting. He took off his glasses, set them on the table, and simply said that people who spend their lives in numbers never make a name for themselves. He didn't say it in anger. He said it like it was a simple fact of life, like a weather forecast. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my plate, put it in the sink, and started loading the dishwasher, exactly as I always did. It had become second nature, turning every insult into some small, necessary chore. I didn't know then that 15 years later, this very habit, this cold, calculating mind, would become my biggest weapon. But before that came the moment of choosing a college. It was a September evening. I was 21 and in the final semester of my senior year. I had completed my accounting degree from Ohio State University, and now I was asking for the fees for an additional certification course to prep for the CPA exam. Just $800, which felt like a mountain of money to me at the time. That same week, Greg got accepted into Miami University's Farmer School of Business. Without a moment's hesitation, my father covered his entire tuition, room, and board, and even bought him a used Honda Accord so he could commute to campus. When I brought up my $800, My mother said money was tight this year, and maybe I should look for a cheaper option at a community college. I did the math. I always did the math. It was in my blood. The gap between the money spent on Greg and the money spent on me was too massive to ignore, yet I ignored it anyway. Because asking questions meant starting a fight, and starting a fight meant abandoning the role I had played for years. I picked up extra shifts at a tax prep office in downtown Dayton, where I sat from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., filling out W-2 forms for people at $16 an hour. I paid the fees myself. No one even asked how I scraped the money together. That night, when I told my father I had paid the fees with my own hard-earned money, he just nodded and said, "Good. At least you can carry your own weight." It wasn't a compliment. It was a verdict that had already been passed and was now just being echoed. This same pattern repeated over and over, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, until an evening I still remember down to the hour and minute, 6:43 p.m., 3 years ago, in that same house on Maplewood Court, where my parents now lived alone. By then, I had become a senior analyst at a mid-sized accounting firm, specializing in forensic auditing. I was working on my first major case, catching invoice fraud at a healthcare company, which had led to 3 executives being prosecuted. But at the dining table, none of that mattered. My Uncle Jerry asked what I was up to these days, and before I could even answer, my father chimed in. "She is always buried in paperwork, like a clerk, counting numbers all day." The whole table burst into laughter. My mother passed the gravy bowl and said, "Well, at least she has a job," like it was some sort of charity. I looked down at my plate. The turkey, that specific brand of ocean spray cranberry sauce my mother bought every year, and the mashed potatoes with way too much butter. I picked up my fork, took a bite, and said nothing. There was no storm brewing inside me, just a calculation running in the background, as if my brain had automatically created a new entry, another line item logged with a date, time, and comment. Have you ever sat at your family's table and felt so small, even when you knew how much you had accomplished? If so, tell me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Storyhaven Daily, because no one saw what was coming next. Driving home that night, I had only one thought in my mind. Keeping the peace is not a virtue. It's just an ignored tab that eventually has to be paid. For the next 2 years, I quietly worked on my career without telling anyone, without expecting a single round of applause. I got my CFE certification, meaning Certified Fraud Examiner, a credential earned only by those who know how to catch the lies hidden behind the money. I landed a senior manager position at a major Columbus firm, Hartfield and Associates, where I started leading forensic audits for mid-sized companies. At home, I never brought it up unless someone asked a direct question. And the questions rarely came. On every phone call, my mother would rave about Denise's new job as a receptionist at a real estate agency, or Greg's company, Whitfield Logistics, which he had started with our dad's help, a small trucking and warehousing firm based on the outskirts of Columbus. I remember one evening at 8:12 p.m. when I told my mom on the phone that I had uncovered a $3.5 million embezzlement case by the CFO of a medical supply company. She just said, "Oh, okay," and immediately changed the subject, asking if I was coming for Thanksgiving and if I could bring my usual pecan pie. I didn't feel bad. Honestly, I didn't feel anything at all, except for a cold, light clarity, like reaching the last page of an audit report where the pattern finally becomes crystal clear. I had realized that you never get validation by begging for it, especially from people who have already made up their minds about what you can't be. Around that same time, buried deep in the old incorporation papers of Whitfield Logistics, lay a detail no one had ever reopened. A detail my father himself had thoughtlessly filled out in 2018 using my name. I stumbled upon this detail when Greg asked me for a favor last month. It was a simple thing, something that didn't seem like a big deal at first. It was 10:05 in the morning when his text came through, asking if I could do a quick, informal financial review for Whitfield Logistics because the company was applying for a new bank loan, and the bank had asked for 3 years of clean books. I said yes, like I always did. But this time, not as a favor, but as a professional. I opened the Delaware Secretary of State's website, plugged in the company's entity number, and started downloading the filing history just as I would for any new client. And right there, under the Articles of Incorporation section, right beneath the 2018 date, in the Registered Agent column, was my name, Margaret Ann Karen. My old address, 221 East Broad Street, Apartment 4B, Columbus. I didn't remember ever signing off on this, but then it hit me. An evening in 2018, when my dad showed up at my apartment with a folder saying it was just a formality. He needed a signature on a piece of paper to get the company off the ground. "You are reliable," he had said, "so we are using your name." I had signed it without reading because back then, I was so used to signing off on everything, no questions asked. Being the registered agent meant that every legal notice, every tax deficiency letter, every state compliance deadline was technically supposed to reach me. But the company never updated my address, so every notice kept going to that old apartment where I hadn't lived for 6 years. And from there, to nowhere. I didn't push my chair back. I didn't take a deep breath. I simply created a new folder on my desktop and named it Whitfield Compliance Gap Analysis. Compliance Gap Analysis. Over the next 10 days, I slowly filled that folder, carefully piecing together every document like an archivist inspecting the foundation of an old building. I discovered that since 2020, the Ohio Department of Taxation had sent Whitfield Logistics 3 separate commercial activity tax notices, each one to that old apartment address, and each one went unanswered because the registered agent, me, never even knew they existed. This meant the company's certificate of good standing had technically been suspended back in 2022 without anyone realizing it. Greg didn't know. My father didn't know. Their accountant never cross-checked it because he only looked at bank statements and payroll, not corporate filing statuses. At 5:26 p.m., Greg walked into my office, the very week the bank loan application deadline was looming. He was a nervous wreck, constantly checking his watch, and said the bank had mentioned some documentation issues, something he couldn't wrap his head around. I offered him a coffee in my usual, soft voice and told him I would look into it. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell the whole truth. Not yet. It's a rule in my profession that I've learned over the years. The real skill lies in delivering the right information at the exact right time, not in a rush. I simply told him there were some filing gaps, that I needed to verify a few things, and that it would take a little time. Greg breathed a sigh of relief, patted my hand, and said he knew he could count on me, that I had always been the most reliable one in the family. I smiled, nodded, and on my laptop, in the next column of the spreadsheet, I typed estimated back taxes and penalties, followed by a number that hovered right around $87,000. File complete status update, effective immediately. The 17th rolled around, and at 1:40 p.m., I arrived at the Midwest Financial Network studios on High Street in downtown Columbus. The makeup artist told me the segment wouldn't be live, it would be recorded, but it was set to air that same evening in a primetime slot at 6:30 p.m. I spoke plainly and clearly, without any dramatics. I explained how something as trivial as a registered agent designation, if left not updated, could put an entire company in jeopardy years down the line. I didn't name any names. I didn't have to. That same evening, exactly at 6:30, in the house on Maplewood Court, my parents were sitting in front of the TV as they did every evening to watch the news. Denise told me later that when my face appeared on the screen, my mother didn't even recognize me at first. Then the spoon slipped from her hand, making a soft clinking sound as it hit the plate. My father didn't say a word. He just leaned forward and turned up the volume. At that very moment, on the other side of Columbus, in Greg's office, his accountant was opening an email from the Ohio Department of Taxation. It stated clearly that Whitfield Logistics' good standing status had been suspended for 2 years, and now the company owed the entire balance, plus interest and penalties, within 90 days. Otherwise, the entity would be formally dissolved. At the bottom of the email was a line that must have stung the most. Please contact your registered agent, Margaret A. Caron, for further documentation. My phone started ringing that night at 8:11 p.m., and it just didn't stop. I watched every call come in, read the names flashing on the screen, put the phone on silent, and went to make myself a cup of tea. Completely at peace, as if it were just another ordinary Tuesday evening. The next morning at 7:08 a.m., I got a text from my dad. Just 4 words, "We need to talk." I replied with a time, 12 p.m. in my office. Completely professional, like a client meeting. All 3 of them showed up. My father, my mother, and Greg sat in my conference room, the very room where all of this had started. My father tried to ask how this happened. His voice lacked the heavy, booming authority I used to hear at the Thanksgiving table. Without missing a beat, I opened the folder and showed them every document, every date, every notice, laid out with a timeline. I explained that as the registered agent, I had no legal obligation to track down my own address and update it. That was the company's responsibility, and the company meant them. My mother said I could have warned them earlier if I had wanted to. I simply replied that I did exactly what a professional does. I documented every fact, tracked every deadline, and when the client didn't ask, I didn't take it upon myself to step out of line and offer unsolicited advice. Because I was their registered agent, not their daughter. At least not in that file. Greg sat in silence, his hands resting on the table. Finally, my father uttered what was probably the hardest sentence of his life, that he had never judged me right. I just nodded. No smile, no tears, just a calm acceptance. Then I told them it was the right time to start the reinstatement process with the bank, if they wanted to. I didn't ask for anything that day. No apologies, no explanations. I didn't need them. The verdict that was handed down at the dining table 15 years ago had finally been overturned. The people sitting at that table now knew that the girl who lived in numbers turned out to be the most powerful one of all. If you liked this story, please share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Story Haven Daily, because the next story will teach you the exact same lesson. Keeping the peace isn't peace. It is just rent that someone someday will definitely collect.